episode of the Art Movement, recorded on the 6th of June after a really heavy week of protests, whether it be for Black Lives Matter protests against racism and police brutality, or the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. And these latter ones seem incredibly hopeless, as the country is surrendering its freedoms to China against its will, and nobody is going to do anything about it. It's not going to happen. Nobody will do anything to stop it. These protests prompted me to think about the various links between art and protests. So, for example, these are just some of the things that I thought of. The Italian futurists at the turn of the 20th century would have reveled in the chaos of these days because they saw chaos and violence as a means for change and really celebrated both. I actually spoke about them in a previous episode of this show. I think it was episode 2. So if you'd like to, you can go back to it and listen to it on Mixcloud, Spotify and Podbean. Just a little plug there. Then, of course, there is the natural association of street protests and street arts or graffiti, where it is often the protesters themselves who spray paint their messages on the walls. And we've seen countless examples of that in the Palestinian conflict, for example, or the Occupy movement. Just a few days ago, we saw huge murals dedicated to the memory of George Floyd appear all over the world. Now, as I speak of this, though, it's interesting to point out that Theodore W. Adorno famously wrote that all art is an uncommitted crime, meaning that art challenges the status quo by its very nature. I don't particularly agree with that statement, although it is true that there has been a long history of celebrating art that has subverted the status quo. In fact, I recorded a whole conversation with London's Guildhall Art Gallery curator Cathy Pearce for Matt's Art Chat, my weekly series of podcast conversations about the arts, where we talked about women artists who grew to challenge the predominant way in which they were depicted within interiors in artworks. Another very obvious art form that is commonly associated with mass protests is music and songs. I mean, they're obviously important in forging group solidarity and a sense of belonging to a common cause. This is true of poetry and literature as well, but music tends to be more accessible and pleasant. The frightening thing about mass protests, however, including the ones that we've seen during these tumultuous days, is that they too, from an aesthetic perspective, are quite beautiful to look at. I mean, there is something spectacular about a group of people marching together through streets, and don't take what I'm about to say the wrong way, but there is beauty to be found in the sensational destruction that some of the people within these groups cause. Smashing windows and looting. I mean, it's sensational, it's spectacular, it's shocking. And again, I say this from a purely aesthetic perspective, so don't take this the wrong way, but you guys understand what I'm saying, you know what I mean? Finally, to end this initial monologue, I would like to draw your attention to the Art in Protest. This is an initiative by the Human Rights Foundation that is designed as an answer to the repression of creativity that authoritarian regimes impose. Art has the power to counter the misinformation that these regimes use to confuse and pacify their populations. This is the reason why the first thing these regimes tend to do after they gain power is to suppress it. So, the Art in Protest actually supports so-called dissident artists by exhibiting their works in various parts of the world in order to create a dialogue about the state of artistic expression on a global scale.